T2 and Aliens are arguably two of the greatest action films of all time. Two groundbreaking achievements in filmmaking that will undoubtedly last the test of time. And if all of this is making you think, what the f does this have to do with Megan?
Hold on to your vaginas.
Good, you're paying attention. Well, first of all, there's obviously a gimmick that each of these franchises lean into, or I guess as far as Aliens is concerned, it kind of paved the way for these types of movies. And we're gonna get into what that gimmick is. But even apart from that, surprisingly, Megan is shaped up into a pretty interesting franchise in its own right. But before we get into my thoughts on Megan 2 specifically, let's talk a little bit about the genre swap and its decades of use in film to varying levels of success. So a genre swap is when an already established franchise decides to separate itself from the genre ties of its predecessor or predecessors in a future installment. For an easy example, we can take a look at something like the first Child's Play film, which despite how many of us imagine Chucky in our heads,
I can't think of a thing to say.
The film series originally was a much more straightforward slasher, with very few one-liners or slapstick elements at all. But when we take a look forward to its future installments like Seed of Chucky, I'd honestly have a hard time even calling this a horror movie. You'd struggle to find a single scene in this movie that takes itself seriously.
Oops, I did it again.
And the genre swap itself was once a fairly common trend in Hollywood, becoming especially popular after the massive success of 1986's Aliens, which took a sharp turn towards action sci-fi from the slow-paced, suspenseful sci-fi horror of the original, complete with iconic action set pieces, a much faster-paced story, and they even threw in some over-the-top action one-liners befitting of the era.
Wake up, pendejo, man, I'm gonna kill you!
And surprisingly, it was really well received. And while this is one of the more critically successful and iconic genre swaps I can think of early on, there did seem to be numerous genre swap titles happening around this time. For example, in 1985, we had Rocky IV, which took what started as a gritty, street-level underdog story and turned it into this Cold War superhero showdown with montages, robots, and a boxing match that saves the world for some reason. And weirdly enough, audiences loved it. Me, not so much, but I guess that doesn't matter. Also in 1985, we had Rambo First Blood Part 2, which is maybe the clearest example of a franchise completely flipping its own DNA. The first Rambo film, First Blood, is pretty much a grounded character drama about a broken Vietnam vet being pushed too far. It's dark, it's sad, it's critical of America's treatment of soldiers post-Vietnam. Then Part 2 comes along and suddenly Rambo's a shirtless, machine gun-toting superhero single-handedly mowing down armies of enemies. It drops almost all of the nuance of the original in favor of pure action spectacle. And again, audiences fucking devoured that shit. Not me, but again, it doesn't matter. These two films turned their characters into larger-than-life action icons, but by doing that, they sacrificed everything that made the original films interesting on a deeper level. Was it worth it? Probably, considering I don't see Stallone's original films working as franchises without bold changes such as these. And that trend carried on throughout the 80s to a point where genre switching in sequels seemingly became more of an expectation than an option. Start small, then go big. Start scary, then go explosive. Start emotional, then go stupid. And I know this comes off as fairly critical of genre-swapped films. I think when a genre swap really does work, it can create some of the most beloved sequels of all time. It's just when they don't, we end up with tonal disasters that completely confuse what the franchise is even supposed to be, yet somehow, more often than not, they still succeed. But I guess we can just blame that on the 80s.
It feels so good to be bad!
And this trend seemed to carry on strong into the 90s, eventually peaking with the greatest genre swap of all time, T2 in 1991. Now what I think both T2 and Aliens have above the large majority of genre swapped films, aside from the groundbreaking direction of James Cameron, is a strong and fully realized concept in the first film. In Alien, we have a fully realized, lived-in universe right from the start. The Nostromo doesn't feel like it's a set. It feels like an actual working-class space freighter, complete with corporate oversight, blue-collar workers just doing their jobs, and a terrifying new species introduced in painstaking detail. By the end of the first film, we already understand Weyland-Yutani, space travel, and how dangerous the xenomorph is, so when Aliens rolls around, Cameron can skip the setup and go straight into colonial marines blasting their way through an alien hive. And in The Terminator, we have an equally fleshed out concept. The rules of time travel are established, Skynet is introduced, humanity's bleak future is laid out, and we've already seen what a single Terminator is capable of. The groundwork is so tight that when T2 starts, Cameron doesn't need to explain the world again. He just drops us right into a bigger, bolder version of it. And just because these initial films worked so well as solo films, that doesn't mean continuing their stories was a disservice to the original. In fact, the universes created were so interesting that it was actually the opposite. It would have been a disservice not to let us visit them again. And I've noticed in some of these weaker genre swaps some of the main reasons that causes them to fail. The first reason is that groundwork wasn't laid properly in the first films. Both Alien and The Terminator set up universes that were so complete they practically begged for expansion. Many weaker genre swaps don't have that. Jaws, for example, works perfectly as a contained thriller, but the world it builds isn't robust enough to sustain sequels without getting silly. When a first film doesn't leave room to grow, any tonal shift in the sequel feels slapped on rather than earned. The second issue I regularly see is that characters don't translate across genres. In Aliens and T2, the characters don't just survive the genre swip, they grow because of it. Ripley goes from survivor to protector, Sarah Connor transforms from victim to warrior, and by contrast, Rambo First Blood Part 2 takes a character who was originally tragic, vulnerable, and emotionally complex, and it reduces him to a near-silent killing machine. He stops being a person and becomes an action icon. And as cool as this looks on a poster, it strips away the human depth that made the first movie resonate. The third one is when the shift misunderstands what the audience actually liked in the first place. Cameron understood that people loved the concept of these worlds, killer machines, terrifying aliens, and humanity at the center. His sequels kept those intact while changing the genre lens. Where we can see this go wrong, we can think of something like Gremlins 2, where the studio clearly misread what people loved about the first one in the first place. The first film worked because it balanced a small town, cozy charm with a real terrifying menace, at least for children's horror movie standards. The Gremlins were both scary and funny in equal measure, but the sequel kind of abandoned that balance, turning the creatures into cartoonish, fourth wall breaking parodies of themselves. And for sure, there were some new fans that enjoyed that slapstick tone, but for many it felt like the heart of the original had been lost in favor of
Because you talk about a gremlin whose sole purpose in this film is just that he looks stupid as fuck. Yes, it can be in the movie, and it is in the movie. Done. Next.
As we move into the 2000s, the genre swap had basically gone out of style. Studios instead opting to stick to safer sequels. Every once in a while you'd get a bold one. Thor Ragnarok was okay, and then the Joker 2 was...
I got the sneaking suspicion that we're not giving the people what they want.
I don't know what the fuck that was. But overall, it seemed like the genre swap had seemingly faded into obscurity. And this is partially why Megan feels so interesting to me. In a time where most franchises play it safe, here comes a film that actually dares to pivot when it really didn't have to. The first film was incredibly successful, but instead of just playing it safe and releasing a samey sequel, it leaned harder into camp. It made it more of a comedy. It doubled its budget and completely dropped the horror in place of sci-fi action. Now, whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, I don't know, let's talk about it. Now, just to be clear, I actually really enjoyed Megan 2, and while it would be a hyperbole to label Megan 2 as our generation's Terminator 2, maybe in another timeline it could have been our generation's Child's Play. But sadly, as much as I enjoyed this film, I do really think it shot itself in the foot conceptually. I do genuinely applaud this film's bold change in direction and attempt to broaden the franchise into something larger than a low-budget teen horror that would inevitably slowly wane into obscurity. And I do understand their desire to try something bold, because as much as the first Megan film is serviceable, it's also about as generic and derivative as a modern horror movie can get. The Child's Play influences are right on the surface, it borrows its near-future Black Mirror aesthetic, and Megan's eerily human personality blurring the line between empathy and manipulation is lifted straight out of Ex Machina. At the end of the day, it's just a remix of other better movies. Megan needed an identity of its own if it was going to stick around for a long period as a franchise. And what identity it actually did have wasn't from the film itself, but from the marketing. The first film blew up as this PG-13, TikTok-friendly meme horror. Teens weren't scared of Megan, they were obsessed with her dance moves and how sassy she could be. And Universal saw this, and they leaned into those memes and campiness as hard as they could, and it worked.
What are you?
I'm Megan.
Raking in $180 million on a $12 million budget. And I think in that success, the studio realized people don't actually want to be scared by Megan, they want to laugh at her. Maybe with a little horror sprinkled in on the side. Maybe they saw it drifting similar to the direction of where Child's Play eventually went. So instead of doubling down on suspense and horror, they pivoted, which left us with Megan 2. And Megan 2 attempts to reframe the whole concept as this quippy sci-fi action franchise. So what's the problem? Well, part of the problem is this change wasn't entirely artistic, it was also very much commercial. PG-13 horror makes a ton of money. Firstly because it's cheap to make, but also because it brings in the entire teen demographic to theaters. Blumhouse knows this, so when they decided they were going to put a much bigger budget behind this sequel, in their minds they had to make it appealing to a wider international market as well to make it worth it. So their logic was, keep it PG-13, keep it campy, instead of horror make it action oriented, and we will likely have a safer, broader box office. But unknowingly to them, this is where it falls apart, because by making that switch, Blumhouse lost sight of who their new audience actually was. The people who went to go see the original Megan in theaters, they weren't hardcore horror fans. They were teenagers, couples on date nights, casual moviegoers, people who just wanted to laugh at the killer TikTok robot. And that's why the PG-13 rating worked so well for them. But the moment they pivoted into campy sci-fi, they were no longer making a movie for that audience. The majority of teens could give a shit about quippy shootouts or corporate espionage plots. That's not what gets them posting clips on TikTok. Instead, you're wandering into the territory of 30 to 40 something camp action horror crowds. The people who grew up on Evil Dead 2, RoboCop, fucking Starship Troopers. Their audience is looking more for something like The Substance than what we got here. This audience wants buckets of gore, practical effects, and R-rated chaos. This is the new crowd Megan 2 should have been aiming for, but refused to actually deliver anything for. And we're left with this weird hybrid, a movie that thinks it's broadening its appeal but actually narrowing its appeal to both camps. The younger meme horror crowd is going to find it too slow and too try-hard, while the older gorehead crowd is going to wonder why this supposedly campy robot bloodbath movie is being held back by a PG-13 rating and off-screening every death. And that's the largest reason this shift feels so conceptually flawed. James Cameron succeeded with Aliens and T2 because he understood his audience and gave them more of what they loved, just differently. Blumhouse miscalculated. They wanted Marvel-style franchise safety in Megan 2, but in the body of a movie that needed to go grindhouse to stand out. I genuinely think had Megan 2 gone for an R rating and leaned more into the adult elements and gore, they could have had a cult classic on their hands like Army of Darkness. But let's loop back into the three main points where genre swaps generally fail, and unfortunately, Megan fails in all three categories to varying degrees. Now this is a pretty glaring limitation when you take a look at the groundwork laid in the first Megan film. As I mentioned before, Alien and The Terminator both built universes so textured that the sequels didn't need to waste time world building, they could just drop us back in and go bigger. By contrast, Megan doesn't really set up a world, it just sets up a gimmick. Sure, there's Funky the toy company, there's Gemma and her research lab, but none of it feels like a world we really care to live in or revisit. There's no corporate dystopia like Weyland-Yutani, there's no doomsday inevitability like with Skynet, and that's a problem. When you don't have a rich foundation, the only thing you have left to expand on is the killer doll herself, which is fine for one movie, maybe two, but the second you try to pivot into an action spectacle, you suddenly realize there's not much there. Instead of scaling up naturally, Megan 2 feels like it's rushing into a whole new genre, grasping for dear life on a very thin premise. This creates an uphill battle for the filmmakers who now have to set up a universe for the viewers to care about, as well as attempt to carefully transition into a brand new genre without feeling like tonal whiplash. Unfortunately, this is another area where Megan 2 struggles, but it's also where the lead actually shines. Megan herself is fairly elastic. She can go from creepy to campy to action ready with ease. Her personality, her dance moves, even her deadpan quips give her a presence that survives the jump from meme horror to sci-fi action, and in a way she seems like the only character who's built for this genre swap. Everyone else though isn't so lucky. Gemma remains a stressed out Silicon Valley mom, never fully stepping into the action role the plot demands. Katie isn't Ripley's Newt, she's just a kid caught in overblown stakes. And while Megan works as a character, she's still largely a viral personality rather than a fully realized villain or anti-hero. Her antics are perfect for TikTok clips and PG-13 horror, but they don't give the audience much to latch onto in terms of emotional stakes or long-form franchise storytelling. So when Megan 2 pivots into action, you can feel the seams. The supporting cast doesn't have the flexibility to survive this shift, leaving the film with a lead that excels and everyone else is awkwardly crammed into a story where they weren't necessarily meant to inhabit. The result is a film where Megan carries the movie, but the world around her can't keep up. And this one is the film's fatal flaw. Like I mentioned earlier, Megan blew up because people thought she was funny, not scary. So the marketing team leaned into that campiness. Megan's attitude, the dance. And the audience that made it a hit were mostly teenagers, couples, casual moviegoers who wanted a PG-13 meme horror to laugh at. But instead of recognizing that, the filmmakers were like, people like Megan, we can do whatever we want with her. Which is only partially true, because while yes, I do think this character could have been genre swapped successfully off the strength of its titular character, that doesn't mean the target audience of its new genre can be ignored completely. Just because you have an interesting character teens resonated with in a PG-13 horror film, it does not mean teens are going to show up in droves for your PG-13 corporate espionage action film. By trying to straddle both of those audiences I mentioned, Megan 2 lands in no man's land. Too tame for the older horror crowd, and too slow and meandering for the younger meme crowd. And at the end of the day, this is what makes the genre swap so misguided. It's not just a tonal change, it's a fundamental misunderstanding of what expectations need to be met when expanding the audience of an existing franchise. I really do like Megan as a character, and I hope this franchise can carry on past this, maybe leaning even further into this new path, but with a better understanding of who their target audience actually is. It's really unlikely since Megan 2 only made $40 million on its $30 million budget, but I don't know, we'll see. But yeah, that's really all I have for you guys. Let me know if you loved or hated Megan 2, and I'll be making more videos soon.